Following all the safety procedures, I bring up the tool rest. I make sure that it clears the corners of the wood. I inspect the blank. I certainly see some cracks, which I'm hoping are surfaced. There's a bark. It's not an inclusion, it's the way I cut the blank. And I'm looking at how straight the blank is. And because we're knocking off corners, and whenever, even with spindle turning, it's so important to wear a face shield. Any of these sharp corners where this piece of bark could come off. So certainly a face shield, check your RPM, make sure it's low to start. You can crank it up where you feel comfortable depending on your lathe. But the first thing I'm going to do then is use, you could, in this point, use a spindle roughing gouge. I'm at the stage now where I generally just do everything with the skew, especially since I'm going to be creating that tenon. So this is a 3/4 inch skew. I know that that depth where the jaw's face goes back to the bottom of that jaw set, it's about a 1/2 inch. So I know if I make a tenon using this tool, which I'll show you, I don't want to go more than about halfway. That'll give me 1/2 of 3/4, 3/8, and that'll be plenty to hold this. Maybe a little bit more. I don't want to go much more then, because it'll bottom out on the bottom of the jaws instead of the shoulder on the front of that on the front of the jaws. It won't seat there. So again, just turn on the lathe slow and then bring it up to speed. Turn the lathe on. It's interesting when a beginner does this. He usually starts very slow, and part of the problem is whatever tool you use, and I think in this case we might as well just go ahead and use the spindle roughing gouge just to illustrate this. I'm going to bring it down ridiculously slow. What tends to happen is you're putting the tool rest. The beginner knows that the tool's got to sit on the tool rest. He's got the handle down so that the edge is not going to engage right away. But what tends to happen is, because it's such a slow speed, the tool kicks back and forth because there's quite a lot of air instead of those corners. So the tool moves back and forth, and you get this sort of thing, which can be kind of discouraging to a beginner. Depending on the lathe you have, the recommendation is to bring it up to a speed that you feel comfortable about, and that'll make it so much easier, especially even with the spindle roughing gouge. It has to be sharp. A freshly ground tool is always important. So now, because it's higher RPM, the air is going past the tool faster. And even though it's the same presentation I had earlier, it's not as jumpy. The other thing is, understand that when most people look at that square, they're looking at the circle. The reality is the diameter is those 4 corners. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a larger diameter than you realize. Depending on what you're seeing now on that camera, I'm not sure, I'm not able to monitor it, but you'll see this is getting closer to round, and the corners aren't jutting as much. I come here, I have to start out farther. Just be aware of that. So at this point, I'm going to make my tenon, even though it's not round yet. And again, I'm going to come up now with the skew. Has a much longer bevel, so I have to bring the handle even lower. I'll start to cut, and I'm going to bring up the RPM even more. And you can see how I'm forming that shoulder. And I'm going for about 1 3/4 inch. And I want the parallel sides. I have a ways to go. I'm looking here, there's a slight crack there. Always inspect that blank, keep an eye on it. That is the right distance now for the jaws, about between 3/8 and 7/16 of an inch. You don't want to go too close to a half. And I usually don't even go to tenon that deep, but that's fine. So let's see, we should be real close. And we are. I can go just a little more, or I could just finesse it, because again, with these one-way jaws, these sides here have to be parallel. You don't want any kind of taper. And you never, generally, I think always, never want a taper going this way. If you are going to taper at all this way. But again, I would just take your time and go for that parallel side And this is where, again, now you could also make this cut with the parting tool. The only thing is it's going to take you a little more time, right? You'd be doing the same idea, coming up, making that, but you'd be doing it 3 times as opposed to just the once. All right, so that's a really nicely formed tenon. It looks like the sides are parallel. There might be some fuzzies here. Knock them out of the way, because even a very slight amount could give you some run out. All right, so now we're going to just mount this in the 4-jaw chuck.